thank you very much for giving me an opportunity to join with you this evening to talk about the situation in Afghanistan and share some reflections that are in part a product of recent analysis of the situation there, but in part a product also of having reflected over a long period of time on the sorts of tensions and challenges that the country faces. I'm particularly pleased that we have with us this evening a number of eminent visitors from Afghanistan whom I may from time to time call on to address particular questions during our question and answer period. I want to begin by making some comments about some of the specific ways in which things went wrong after the displacement of the Taliban regime in 2001. I then want to share the findings of a recent survey by the Asia Foundation, which is the best picture we have of opinion within Afghanistan at the moment. Of course, public opinion is almost always divided, but the findings of this particular survey give a nuanced picture of the way in which opinion pans out there. I then want to say a little bit about insurgency and a little bit about where one might go from here. One of the misfortunes of Afghanistan was that in the aftermath of the overthrow of the Taliban, the regime which came into place as what I'd call a neo-patrimonial system, in which one had a blending in a rather disruptive and dysfunctional way of both formal institutions of democracy and patterns of networking and patronage, which give a quite different kind of twist to the actual functioning of a system that might formally provide ordinary people with an opportunity to change the government without bloodshed. This was then compounded by a rather sinister equation, which is that if you have a complex bureaucracy, which Afghanistan certainly got from the Bonn conference that Martin mentioned, plus a lot of aid money coming in because foreign forces want to see improvements very quickly, there's almost nothing more predictable than that you will get corruption under those circumstances, because palms have to be greased in order to secure prompt approvals from different involved bureaucratic agencies for projects to be implemented, and that really provides a very destructive incentive structure which was put in place early in Afghanistan. The environment of Afghanistan after 2001 was also a very unpromising one, because whilst Pakistan was initially under pressure from the Bush administration to behave itself in Afghanistan, unfortunately the Americans found that they were increasingly dependent upon logistical access to Afghanistan via Pakistani territory, and this led to a dissipation of pressure and therefore a resumption by military circles in Pakistan of an attempt to meddle in Afghanistan and unsettle any government in Afghanistan that they saw as less than comprehensively supportive of Pakistan's agenda. This was then compounded, of course, by waning interest on the part of the United States following the invasion of Iraq in March 2003. And that particular event undoubtedly sucked a lot of oxygen out of the Afghan theatre of operations and blunted the momentum of transition. And momentum is very important. If large numbers of people in a country think that there's no going back to the past, there won't be much risk of going back to the past. But if people sense that international actors are not credible when they make commitments to stay for the long run and to assist domestic transition, then people are going to recalculate how it is most rewarding for them to position themselves. And ordinary people in Afghanistan don't necessarily spend much time reading the constitution, but they tend to have an acute understanding of political power, because an understanding of power dynamics is much more important for day-to-day survival in Afghanistan than it is in a country like Australia. There have been some striking social developments, however, which run parallel with these political developments, but which have transformed Afghanistan both from what it was in the period when Martin first went there and the period that he and I both remember from the end of the 1990s and the early 2000s, when the country really was cut off from the world. There were virtually no working telephones in Kabul. Very few people had the opportunity to travel except as refugees to Pakistan or Iran. Now there are an estimated 8 to 16 million mobile phones in Afghanistan. I can stand in the street in Kabul and telephone my 95-year-old mother in Australia and ask whether she's safe. And lots of Afghans over a period of 38 years have seen family members displaced as refugees to many different parts of the world, and they are now able to use this new networking opportunity to stay in touch with those relatives. The bright young generation in Afghanistan that has seized opportunities that arose after 2001, opportunities which emphatically were not there before, are frankly as bright and as gifted as you will find in any country, anywhere in the world. This is not to say that youth automatically are a positive force, because young people, if they become disappointed with a transition, can become very angry as well, and that's something that needs to be recognised. But nonetheless, there is an enormous amount of talent on the ground in Afghanistan that is too little recognised, but which is potentially very valuable for the future. At the level of the political elite, however, there is still quite a dead hand of the past that lies across the establishment, and although after the heavily contested and fraught 2014 presidential election a national unity government was established, it's not a happy space in a lot of respects, and disappointment with its performance certainly needs to be noted. That brings me to the second area I want to discuss, which is the recent findings of the Asia Foundation's annual survey of opinion in Afghanistan. And strikingly, the survey found that 57% of respondents believed that the country was going in the wrong direction, which is the first time that more than 50% of respondents have actually voiced that opinion. And in a way, this is, if not exactly a vote of no confidence in the national unity government, it certainly suggests major concerns that people continue to entertain about how the country is performing. It's simply that people can also, in responding to a question like this, be giving voice to concerns which are in a sense beyond the capacity of a government to control, so we can't sheet everything back to the government. Having said this, there is very little evidence that the armed opposition, the Taliban, the Haqqani network, those kind of groups, enjoy popular support. 70% of respondents said that they had no sympathy whatsoever for the armed opposition. Only 6% of Afghans voiced strong support for the armed opposition. And Dr. Susanna Schmeidel, who's with us this evening from the University of New South Wales, mentioned to me earlier that a report that she's been involved in preparing for publication by the Afghanistan Analyst Network, based on qualitative interviews with people in troubled parts of the country, again paints a picture of people who are, even if from the Pashtun ethnic group, very sceptical of the Taliban and their claims to be reformers or people who represent their interests in particular. That said, 57% expressed satisfaction with the way democracy works. 66% expressed confidence in the media, and the quality media in Afghanistan, particularly television, in my view, exceed the quality of any electronic media in Australia. Talkback radio is much more sophisticated. They have excellent political debates at the top of the pile within Afghanistan. You can easily tune into a debate in the run-up to election where you'll have Afghans with doctorates from Oxford and Columbia and excellent universities being allowed to speak at length about complex issues without being interrupted by an interviewer who simply wants to speed on the process. So there are good things going on there which seem to be reflected in the responses of those who were queried in the Asia Foundation survey. 57% of people also expressed confidence in President Ghani, who is a very energetic and dynamic figure, even if one of the more difficult people one might wish to encounter. I remember many years ago when the giant tarantula Belinda died at London Zoo. The London Zoo put out a press release which said, quote, "With her sunny and outgoing personality, Belinda was a perfect ambassador for all the values of the London Zoo." Well, no one would accuse the President of Afghanistan of having a sunny and outgoing personality. He does, however, have a lot of energy and very clearly developed thoughts on state building. And like so many politicians, he runs into the difficulty that he has some of the skills and strengths which make a great leader, but not all of them. And the question then is how these are balanced against each other in the particular circumstances which Afghanistan faces. There is a widespread perception that the 2014 election was not free and fair. 58% of respondents said that. And confidence in the Independent Elections Commission in Afghanistan went from 66% to 36% over the year from 2014 to 2015 as the scale of electoral fraud came to be established. 40% of respondents said they would emigrate if given the opportunity to do so. Now, some would say, well, the fact that 57% said they wouldn't even if they were given the opportunity to do so is in some respects encouraging. But it does help explain why 200,000 people from Afghanistan entered Europe last year. There's far too little understanding of just what was the scale of exodus from Afghanistan. And of course, this one factor contributing to this is the closing off of the route of egress into Southeast Asia and then Australia from Afghanistan, which was previously a significant recipient of Afghan refugees. And the lesson here is that if you don't have any confrontation with the root causes of refugee movements, stopping the boats doesn't actually stop boats. It actually moves boat movement into another part of the world, from Turkey to Greece, or it forces people into shipping containers being moved by the Russian mafia. It doesn't necessarily save a single life. It just makes self-indulgent politicians feel that they're really acting morally when they say that all they're concerned about is death at sea. Ha ha. The overall picture I think we see at the moment is one of very considerable fragility, a great deal of uncertainty on the part of ordinary people, and I think the risk of a cascade. One of the great dangers in Afghanistan is not that the armed opposition will grind their way town by town through the country. That's not going to happen. The danger is that if people think they might come back to power, people for prudential reasons will shift their alignments, not because they like the Taliban or the Haqqani network, but because it does not pay to be on the losing side in a place like Afghanistan. Nasty things can happen to you. And therefore, the danger is that people will make a rational calculation that leads them to realign. That's how regimes changed in Afghanistan in 1992 and 2001. And if we witness a regime change in Afghanistan, it will probably be because of something like that. Now, in a way, Afghanistan would cope reasonably well with its internal problems if it were not for the insurgency being fueled by Pakistan. The problems are serious, but they could be addressed. The great difficulty, I think, is that Pakistan has ongoing geopolitical interests that are unlikely to dissipate unless very firm pressure is brought to bear on the Pakistan leadership from other kinds of sources. And there's still a profound apprehension about the objectives of India, Pakistan's huge neighbour to the east, and a great fear that a pro-Indian Afghanistan could leave Pakistan wedged in a very unseemly situation geopolitically between two hostile actors. And the sadness really is that Pakistan's optimal outcome in Afghanistan would almost certainly be a pro-Pakistani regime. If it can't get that, its next best outcome is probably an unstable Afghanistan rather than a stable Afghanistan with a pro-Indian regime. So in that sense there is a structural incentive to meddling in Afghanistan that we've seen on quite a scale, and that's then compounded by historical events such as the problem of the Durand Line, the fact that Afghanistan in 1947 was the one country to vote against the admission to Pakistan to the United Nations over this very issue. And because historically for the next 30 years relations between Afghanistan and Pakistan were very tense. But Pakistan does have reasons for apprehension about its geopolitical situation, especially having lost East Pakistan when Bangladesh was formed at the end of 1971. Nonetheless, the principles of world order, particularly those embodied in the Charter of the United Nations, do warn against states engaging in acts to destabilise neighbouring countries, and sovereign statehood involves not just rights but duties, and one of the duties of sovereign statehood is to prevent one's territory being used for violent attacks on the territory and population of a neighbouring country. So one can certainly build a case of principle for pressuring Pakistan over what it's been doing. This has become a matter of very sharp focus in Afghanistan ever since the Taliban, from late September to mid-October last year, took over the city of Kunduz in the north, something that caused great shock in Kabul and other cities, and which certainly reflected military tactics which were much more those of a conventional military than a disorganised peasant militia. I think we've moved well beyond any point of that sort. And that, combined with ambient instability reflected in a number of different developments in Afghanistan, helps explain the difficulties. The UN report on civilian casualties in Afghanistan for 2015 that was published 4 days ago specifically highlights the kidnapping and physical threat to members of the Hazara minority. There was a very dramatic development in Kabul in November last year when a group of victims of this kind of terror known as the Zabul 7 saw their coffins being carried by women to the gates of the presidential palace, a symbolically incredibly powerful development to express concern that the state seems incapable of providing day-to-day protection for people who need it the most. And of course, if you can attack anyone at random, what you do is undermine the credibility of any claim of the state to perform a core state structure, which is to provide security for the population. So from the Taliban's point of view, you don't have to attack somebody because they're a known enemy. Attacking anyone and getting away with it is an effective device for undermining the legitimacy of the state, and we've seen that kind of thing happening too. Complicated, of course, by the emergence of Islamic State, perhaps by existing groups rebadging themselves in eastern Afghanistan. President Ghani has seized on this to pressure the United States and other allies to slow down the withdrawal of their forces from Afghanistan, and it's proved quite an effective tactic. But at the same time, the Asia Foundation survey showed that 50% of Afghans now believe that ISIS is active in the districts from which they come, not just the country, but the districts from which they come. So in a way, it's not surprising that we've seen 200,000 people seeking to enter Europe from Afghanistan this year. I suspect that if I were in Afghanistan, in certain parts of the country at least, I'd be thinking very carefully about that. Let me conclude briefly with a couple of thoughts about where we might go from here. There's great virtue in bringing different disaffected tribal actors into a relationship with the government, but I think we should be wary of the seductive allure of peace talks with the Taliban. They're now a more divided force than they've been in the past. There's little evidence that they subscribe to any of the norms of negotiating or world order which typically have made agreements stick if one has signed them. Who the interlocutors would be in a meaningful negotiation is far from clear. Negotiations taking place in the eyes of ordinary people can disincline ordinary people to support the government because they don't know what's going to come out as a result of the negotiation process. People can decide to sit on the fence when they're witnessing these kind of things taking place. So that's a problem. There's also the issue of whether Pakistan, if it were not confident that a negotiated settlement would guarantee its interest in Afghanistan, might not simply confect another group to generate instability in Afghan territory, which it's quite capable of doing. And there's also the problem that countries like Russia and India and Iran might respond to a perceived enhancement of the power of the Taliban in Afghanistan by themselves seeking to arm other groups in the country that are relentlessly anti-Taliban. So you could see a reconfiguration of the nature of armed conflict in Afghanistan without any real breakout of peace. And finally, the Taliban actually behaved pretty badly in Kunduz when they took it over for 2 weeks at the beginning of October. And a lot of people, I think, have been reconsidering whether some of their rhetoric about being more respectful of girls and women and being more disposed to rethink their performance in the past has any substance or meaning whatsoever. So I think a lot will rest on how Pakistan responds, and in a way, if Pakistan were rational, it would cut its links with groups like the Afghan Taliban pretty quickly, because what we've witnessed in the last few years has been the emergence, the crystallisation in Pakistan itself of a Pakistan Taliban movement, clearly stimulated by the kinds of messages that the Afghan Taliban were putting forward, which is now a terrible threat to civilians in Pakistan. We saw over 150 school children and their teachers massacred in a school near Peshawar in December 2014. We saw on the 1st of January this year an attack on a university near Peshawar. These kinds of groups almost point to a model of Pakistan as a sorcerer's apprentice, which has let loose all sorts of spells and now can't control the forces that it's liberated except by coming down on them in their entirety. And the Chinese may well be taking some steps to bring pressure to bear on Pakistan in this respect too. The United States lacks credibility as a source of pressure on Pakistan, but China doesn't. It's Pakistan's main ally and protector. And there's some evidence that the Chinese are becoming more and more worried that the kinds of messages that have been dissipated by the Afghan Taliban and the Pakistan Taliban might find their way into the Uyghur Muslim population in Xinjiang in the west of China and create a security problem for China as well. So that, I think, is something to watch. But I think there are two reasons why we should be absolutely certain not to forget Afghanistan. One is that the implications of a really bad failure in Afghanistan will not be confined to that part of the world. We'll see it in refugee movements. We could see it in inspiration of radical groups in wider parts of the world, and we could see it in regional instability. And in a way, my great fear is that if at the end of the day the perception is that the international endeavour in Afghanistan has really failed badly, this could inspire a group like Lashkar-e-Toiba in Pakistan to attempt a really big terrorist attack in India. And how the Modi government in India would respond to something like that is something about which I would be far from confident. And I'd rather be in the southern hemisphere than the northern hemisphere if that would happen. But the final point I'd make is I think we owe an obligation to the people of Afghanistan. We went into Afghanistan and made all sorts of promises that they wouldn't be abandoned again and that they wouldn't be going back to the past. And I don't particularly care about the orientation of political leaders in capitals like Washington or London or Paris, but I do actually feel we owe a very, very strong responsibility to the very fine people of Afghanistan, who ultimately are just like us. They just happen to be in a country where the sky fell in about 38 years ago, and they've had to cope with it ever since. But they're no different from us. And I'll conclude with a comment that was made by an American political scientist, Barnett Rubin, which I think illuminates this point. And he said, we always ask ourselves why the Afghans are different from us. What we should ask is what kinds of circumstances and incentives drive people who are actually exactly like us to act in different ways. And I think once you've framed things in that sense, you begin to be in a position to recognise that we can owe duties to people such as the people of Afghanistan just on the strength of common humanity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, William. Can I ask you once again to show your appreciation to both the speakers we've had?